We all hate it when we're having a great time playing a game and then, bam, all of that fun suddenly grinds to a halt in one level that we just can't stand. Now, admittedly, game design is hard, and that's a massive understatement. And as a result, maintaining an entertaining time for hours and hours on end is extremely challenging, so it shouldn't be a surprise that even the finest devs drop the ball occasionally. And from poring over the last year or so of video games, these are the ones that offered up a single infuriating level that left players absolutely spare. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 levels everybody hated from recent video games. But first, an honourable mention: Miquella's Haligtree, Elden Ring. Now, this one sits at an honourable mention because I need to stress that Miquella's Haligtree is an absolute beast of a level. I really enjoyed it personally, but the reason that I mentioned that it's hated is, well, it's absolutely piss hard. In fact, those 2 words alone, Miquella's Haligtree, are sure enough to strike fear and anxiety into all but the hardiest of players. For starters, Miquella's Haligtree is a pain in the arse to traverse. It is hilariously easy to fall off the branches to your doom, and the dungeon itself is packed with aggravating ranged enemies, enough that even for the standards of From Software it feels like an unreasonable ask. It's kind of a parody of a typical FromSoft post-game dungeon, a weapons-grade pain in the arse that exists only to torture those who dare venture into it. Number 8, The Sewers Stray. There's absolutely no denying that Stray is one of the biggest fan-favourite games of the year. An incredibly accessible adventure in which players control an adorable stray cat in a walled, dystopian cyber city. But the game's 8th level, The Sewers, is a bit of a damp squib in an otherwise riveting journey. Though moody and atmospheric to a point, it's hampered by the irritation of having to repeatedly deal with massive swarms of Zerks, a fleet of grotesque mutated bug-like creatures which can make short work of you if you let them. You're required to use your ultraviolet light weapon to explode these Zerks, or otherwise make a mad dash away from them. If hardly brutally difficult, it is nevertheless the least chill area of the game, and the part which surely give casual players the most trouble. In tandem with the relatively repetitive environments, this made The Sewers a pretty shocking 20-minute lull in an otherwise splendid experience. Number 7, Singularity, Horizon Forbidden West. Horizon Forbidden West was, for the most part, a rock-solid sequel, though unfortunately it saved the worst for last with its utter slog of a final level, called Singularity. After the absolute thrill of overriding a Sunwing and battling Regalia in the previous level, Singularity felt like an underwhelming anticlimax, and that's before we get to the actual plot. In terms of gameplay, it takes around an hour to reach the final boss, Spectre Prime, with most of this time spent listlessly battling your way through enemies to the launch tower, followed by a total nothing burger of a boss fight against Eric. It feels both basic and exhausting at the same time, and that's before we even get to Spectre Prime, an infuriating final boss which represents a massive difficulty spike compared to the rest of the game. Basically, if you haven't done much side content prior to this level, you're gonna have a bad time, and might end up bumping the difficulty down out of sheer irritation. Between Prime's absurd amount of health and the cheapness of their debilitating attacks, this fight and the level as a whole ends the game on a disappointing down note. Number 6, Chaos Island, Sonic Frontiers. Sonic Frontiers is certainly one of the most divisive games of the year, some lauding it as an ambitious attempt to do something different with the Sonic franchise, while others dismissed it as a generic open-world bloatfest. But the game assuredly grinds to a halt when players reach the 3rd hub world, Chaos Island, which is a chunky pain to navigate and, as such, far longer than it needs to be. In the middle of the game, it saps Frontiers of most of the momentum that it had. That's also without getting into the overabundance of 2D gameplay and the legendarily awful pinball minigame, which requires players to reach a high score of 5 million points. This is an absurdly unreasonable requirement, which, due to being a mandatory part of the gameplay, left many people stuck for literally hours. All in all, most players were simply relieved when they finally made it past Chaos Island and Sonic Frontiers regained some of its groove, because in a game already packed with busy work, this was the zenith of turgid time-wasting nonsense. Number 5, The Mines, Somerville. It's fair to say that Somerville was one of the year's most disappointing games. Not bad by any means, but a distinctly ordinary offering from one of the minds behind Limbo and Inside. It is at least a visually entrancing alien invasion game for the majority of its playtime, save for a thunderously dull trip to some mines that saps most of the life out of the game in its middle portion. We end up spending around half an hour of this mere 3-hour game traipsing through the most bland environment imaginable, and without any sufficiently clever or intriguing puzzles to elevate this tired setting. For an alien invasion game to spend so long in such a tedious place is just kinda baffling, especially given the infinitely more compelling wide open locales we're treated to otherwise throughout. In a game that already felt a little undercooked from the start, this sequence damn near sucked all the air out of the room. At least with it being so short, most players just persevered on regardless. Number 4, JEANN'S Stealth Chapters Bayonetta 3. Though Bayonetta 3 was largely deemed worth the wait by fans, there is one aspect of the story mode that didn't go down quite so well, and that's the mandatory 4 side chapters starring JEANNE. Peppered throughout the campaign of 4 stealth-centric side-scrolling missions, which, while hardly challenging in the slightest, feel totally at odds with the gameplay of the main story. The stealth mechanics are so hilariously basic that these levels are ultimately tedious diversions, rather than the chilled-out palate cleansers that they were clearly intended to be. Every time these levels appear, they simply stifle the momentum of the considerably more exciting core campaign, and aren't even interesting to look at. As such, they clearly should have been optional content for completionists, even if the character of JEANNE is absolutely excellent. Number 3, Part 5, Return to Monkey Island. Return to Monkey Island was a mostly glorious return to form for the beloved point-and-click adventure series, though there's no denying that the final section went down like a lead balloon with many fans. The 5th and final chapter is a rushed confrontation with LeChuck, or rather, not really. See, the level involves reaching LeChuck's underground lair and then working through a series of comically trivial statue-based puzzles, apparently leading to a showdown with the big bad. But protagonist Guybrush Threepwood then emerges in a theme park recreation of Melee Island, and it turns out that LeChuck and everybody else were actually just animatronics the whole damn time. Plus, fans hoping to finally learn what the secret of Monkey Island was were once again left with a non-committal non-answer, no matter which of the game's several endings that they settled upon. Given that few of the established subplots were tied up during the climax, it did kind of feel like an abrupt ending, as though the developers simply ran out of time to complete it. Number 2, Alone, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Although you have to give Infinity Ward some begrudging credit for making Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2's campaign arguably the toughest in the entire series, there is one level where it becomes more of a chore than a challenge. And we're talking about the game's 13th level Alone, where an injured and double-crossed Soap has to make it through the streets of Las Almas and back to Ghost without being killed by Shadow Company. Without any weapons, you're forced to go the stealthy route for most of the level, sneaking around the streets and crafting items to distract or otherwise incapacitate enemies. But between the enemies' sharp vision and how you can be killed by just a few bullets, it's ultimately a frustrating slog of a mission that becomes only a little more bearable when you finally get weapons near the end, given the abundance of armored foes thrown your way. While short stealth missions can serve as fun breathers between the more typical Call of Duty carnage, and good lord if they relied on that being true throughout this entire franchise, this was long and frustrating enough to kill the campaign's pacing dead in its tracks. And honestly, it never really recovers from this point on. Number 1, the platform ride to Arcas, the Callisto Protocol. Though the Callisto Protocol is a fairly short and straightforward survival horror action romp, like its spiritual predecessor Dead Space, it does suffer from a few hellacious difficulty spikes. And none have given players more of a headache than the set piece at the end of the chapter below, where, while taking the 5-minute platform to Arcas, you've got to survive a massive wave-based onslaught of enemies coming from all sides. If you're ill-equipped and don't have solid spatial understanding of the platform's layout, this is absolute hell. And even then, it's a major skill check for basically everyone involved. Thankfully though, there is a checkpoint ahead of the level's real challenge, that being a boss fight against a brutally difficult 2-headed monster. But overall, this is an inconsistent and irritatingly difficult section that feels more like a failure of design than a true test of the player's competence. As such, it's little surprise that much of the social media chatter surrounding the game is currently focused on how controller-throwingly annoying this level is. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you think about these frustrating levels? And are there any worst ones I missed off here? Let me know, and while you're down there, if you could, please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture Gaming for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.